Hello and welcome to Sansad TV. You're watching Viewpoint with me, Frank RAUSAN PEREIRA. Well, India has firmly established itself as the third largest startup ecosystem in the world. The nation's entrepreneurial landscape, fueled by more than 100 unicorns, is redefining innovation and creating new opportunities across sectors. Through initiatives like Startup India, the government has played a pivotal role in nurturing this growth and empowering the next generation of entrepreneurs. However, the startup ecosystem hasn't been immune to governance lapses. Often, the intense pressure to scale rapidly has led to issues like compromised unit economics, unhealthy work cultures, and significant layoffs. In this edition of Viewpoint, we will analyze the startup ecosystem and their governance. Joining me on the program today are ANUJ TEWARI, co-founder and CFO, Yulu, and Moksh Bhatt, corporate governance expert and partner, AP and Partners. Thank you to my guests for joining me on this edition of Viewpoint. Anuj, let me start the program with you first. Let's just try and understand, put into perspective really what the startups ecosystem looks like at the moment. How are startups doing on the whole?
Thanks, Frank. Frank, for inviting me on this program. Startup system, I would say startup is nothing new. It's just a new form. We always had a old entrepreneurship tradition in India. Where startups differ is it's actually technology first, innovation first, disrupting the established market norms. And certainly, as you mentioned, pressure to grow and scale fast. Some companies which they take decades to achieve, startups are supposed to achieve that in matter of years, if not months. So there's certainly pressure, but if you see, we're still doing good. More than 1.5 lakhs startups are registered with DPIIT, generating 1.6 million, and by 2030 this number is supposed to reach 50 million. So yes, this is another very important factor which has happened in the startup world is democratization of this. It is no longer concentrated in big cities like Gurgaon or Bangalore or Mumbai. It is now, entrepreneurs are coming from even tier 2 cities. Maybe it's Indore, Jaipur, Lucknow. So yeah, I would say that they are doing well. And I think this will be the form factor of entrepreneurship, which will actually help realize one of the key engines in help realizing India dream of, Amrit Kal of reaching 2047. So yes, I think ecosystem is in good shape. Could be better, yes.
All right, there's always scope for improvement. The ecosystem could be better, but we are well on track really as far as our dream of Viksit Bharat or 2047 is concerned, is what Anuj is suggesting. All right, wonderful. Let's bring in Moksh as well into the picture now. Moksh, let's look at it from, let's hear your initial remarks, your thoughts really as far as the startup ecosystem, and you're also a governance expert. There have been several governance lapses really as far as startups are concerned of late as well. What's causing this really?
Thanks, Frank. So the way we have to look at it, and I think Anuj made a very valid point that these are ultimately innovative businesses, right? These are high-risk businesses. A lot of them are expected to fail, and investors invest in these businesses knowing that only maybe 1 out of 10 will succeed. And that is really not something that anybody is bothered by. That is sort of the game itself, right? The challenge comes when there is more than just business failure, because business failure is something that investors accept and recognize, and that is the reason why you have these high valuations. For example, let's say if there are investors or other founders who are not being as careful as they need to be in taking decisions, or are crossing some lines that they ought not be crossing. And I think from my perspective, at least, what's important there is that companies have boards. Those boards play a role in these sorts of situations in managing risk, and perhaps there is a little more need for a more assertive board or for investors to take a more careful look. But outside of that, I would say the ecosystem itself is doing great. We're one of the largest ecosystems of the kind in the world, and I don't think that's changing anytime soon.
Wonderful. Good to hear that, and good to know that the startup ecosystem is robust and is doing wonderfully well. And I think, like you rightly pointed out in your initial remark, that startups are high risk at the end of the day, and the way they are set up is to ensure that it's going to be either extremely successful or bust. Coming back to you now, Anuj, let's look at really some challenges, some issues of governance, or what really are the big roadblocks in running a successful startup? You are a co-founder of a successful startup yourself, who has been scaling up as well rapidly. So how do you look at this journey?
I would say, actually, I will just break down what are the challenges. So we have to look at the operating environment where startups, do operate, right? It is a high flex environment. Need for fast-paced growth, stretches the resources, systems, processes. What we say is like we are building runway as the plane is taking off. So there will always be some kind of stretches, pull and pushes. And in that case, what I would say experienced founders or the investors, what we have to do at that point of time, build system processes, which kind of work as a guardrail against, individual arbitrariness, sometimes taking a risk which are not uncalled for, setting up, for example, one very important bulwark is independent auditor, a board which is independent. So these are all the guardrails which you have keep setting over the course of the time to build a startup which can be scaled in the right manner and fashion. So yeah, that would be my input at this point of time.
All right, and since we are here, how much of a challenge or how much of pressure is there really on startups? You also look at the, as CFO, you look at the finances and everything else very closely. What kind of pressure is really there on a startup or members who run a startup, the founders, to scale up?
So see, you have taken money, you raised a money, third-party money, right? You have submitted a business plan. Business plan is actually as good as, when the rubber hits the road, there will be 20 things, one thing which is in an Excel. But once you reach the road and implement it, there will be a lot of challenges. Now, one is a shortcut when you say you start some startups, and especially a lot of time, I would say some of the investors are also equally guilty, where they are pushed to cook up performances. But sometimes, you should know as a CFO, your role is that you should actually always present what is the actual picture. It's a tough and hard call. You may not appear good in front of too many stakeholders, but that is the right call in the long term. So what you have to maintain, that should always be an accountability and transparency in what you are reporting. So yeah, it becomes a little difficult job, but that is your job, I think, to, always maintain sense of fairness, transparency, and accountability.
I think that's absolutely key. Transparency and accountability is something that is of utmost importance, and not just with startups, but across the board as well. Coming back to you, Moksh, as far as investors, since we brought up investors as well, what is it that the investors really are looking at as far as funding is concerned, and not just funding, but also scaling up? Really, what is it that they look at? Because investors and funders put in a lot more money as the business grows as well.
Right. So from an investor's perspective, and this is coming more from my engagement with various investors. Ultimately, it is a team that you're taking a bet on. So it is very much the founder that you're betting on. The rest of it is sort of bells and whistles in that, there has to be a business plan and there has to be an idea. So think of it like this. There are three things that you need for a successful startup. You need a good team, you need a good idea, and then you need a large amount of capital to make it happen. And that is, in some ways, the secret sauce of this. Without any of these, the whole thing is not possible. So that's what an investor looks for. I would say when you're taking these bets, investors are also mindful of the risk that they're taking and expect returns which are commensurate with the risk that they're taking. And that is sort of, the play that sort of the dynamic that you have in the system. We should also sort of think of one other thing which is very important, because every now and then you hear of is there enough corporate governance in startups? The fact of the matter is that there shouldn't be too much, right? These are supposed to be fast-moving entities that are looking to disrupt. So almost by definition, there shouldn't be too much corporate governance because they need to move fast. Of course, there is need to manage risk, and that is why you have boards and you have independent auditors. But we need to be mindful that you can't have too much of it at an early stage, at least.
Absolutely. And since you brought this up, a quick follow-up question on the composition of the board, the kind of role, or what is it that the board really looks at and should be looking at really to ensure that there is some kind of hand-holding, to ensure that there are no red lines crossed as far as the startups are concerned?
So the rules, Frank, are fairly clear in that one, of course, is that investors are careful about their own money and they put in rights when they're investing so that they can sort of have visibility on what is being done with their money. So, for example, there are quarterly or monthly, information reports that go out. But outside of that, and these are rules that have been there from almost, ever since the definition or the idea of a company came about, which is that there are directors of a company. Those directors have fiduciary obligations. Well, now, what does that mean? That means that a director doesn't act for the investor or the founder. It has to act for the best interest of the company, right? And as long as that basic idea sort of guides your behavior, you will ask the right sort of questions. And that is the most important thing when you are a director. Are you asking the questions that you're supposed to be asking, or are you rubber stamping whatever is coming your way? And that, I think, is where there is a need for people to sometimes be a little more careful of the decisions that they're approving or asking the right questions. But the framework is clear. It just needs to be implemented sometimes more robustly than it is.
Absolutely. All right, Anuj, let me come back to you now. Let's also understand the kind of, since we're talking about the ecosystem as a whole as well, the kind of schemes that are in place really to help startups, not just setting up of startups, but also once a startup is set up, really, the kind of hand-holding that is required, what's in place to ensure that the sector itself gets that kind of support that is required, and what is the kind of support that is required?
So I will start. Again, I'm speaking from the ecosystem. We are lucky that this is our second or third inning, right, in Yulu. So we have learned, we have understood, we have made our part of mistakes, and we learn from that. But if I go back to my journey when we were young and, when we did our first startup and whatever reason was. So one very important requirement at that point of time is to access to the right kind of mentorship, some kind of pool of, of a tribal knowledge. What are the best practices? See, sometimes this knowledge comes at very high cost. You can get right consultants and all, but then many startups neither have the resources nor the time at that point of time. And probably in my experience as a CFO, the best time to sow the seed is when you are starting, because the culture of transparency, accountability, checks and balances starts right from the beginning, actually. You may not have the all system and framework, but the thought process should be there. And that culture has to be from the start. So very importantly, there has to be some kind of a body where a young person who is starting his entrepreneurial journey can access that kind of insights and know-how in start of his journey, right? So that would be great support. And I think Government of India has, and many other state governments and other bodies have done commendable jobs, right? In the form of incubation centers. Even you mentioned Startup India, it also offers a lot of corporate governance, regulatory and legal advisory. What more could be done is probably set up some kind of workshops with incubation centers or institutes or some other places where this knowledge is actually more disseminated to the new founders or new entrepreneurs. And even for people like us, you can always get better. There's no stop to it. Of course, you learn through your journey also, but if someone can actually, you can get to know, okay, this is the better practice, this is what you should think about it, even from the start. I think that would be a great foundation stone for setting the right corporate governance framework. See, there will always be bad apples. You can always, but there are some inadvertent mistakes which can be actually eliminated through these kind of workshops, guidance, coachings.
Absolutely. Hold that thought. I'll come back to you, in the next round and talk to you about, the kind of lessons that you have learned with Yulu over the last 3 years and good practices that you have, incorporated as well. I'll come back to you on that as well. But Moksha, let me bring in another perspective and another aspect here. You have startups who have been doing extremely well, and in the past we've seen startups also exiting the country and moving elsewhere. Now, how do we stop that from happening? Is that an issue that needs to be addressed?
In a way, yes. So there are broadly two reasons why startups sometimes have gone overseas from India. One is the more natural one, which is that your market is overseas. So you have a management team here or a startup here, and it realizes that actually its market is the United States. So it would make sense for them to go, and that's the natural thing to do. What has also happened is that startups have moved overseas for ease of access to capital. Because let's say there is an investor in the US and it says, I will only invest in US companies. And there was a trend where a lot of companies from India went overseas on account of this. Luckily, now that trend is shifting, partly on account of the way the markets are going in India. So they are shifting back, and that's a trend that we're seeing a fair bit of. If I were to say what is it that the government can do, it can sort of help facilitate an environment where it becomes easier to invest, which means basically reduce compliance requirements for fundraising. The government has taken steps in that direction, but more can be done.
Absolutely. All right, Anuj, coming back to you now, let's try and understand, try and talk about the lessons that, you have learned with Yulu over the last 3 years, the kind of mistakes that were made along the way as well and have now been overcome.
Again, Frank, Yulu, my journey with Yulu in the last 5 years. So when I started, Yulu just closed Series B, though I have been associated with Yulu. Again, we were 4 friends who knew each other almost 30 plus years. So there was one level of comfort. And we all have had decently successful career. So, Yulu was more of, you can say again, kind of a midlife itch that we wanted to do something which is profit with purpose. So with this genesis, things were a little bit easier for me. I sometimes feel not every CFO or everyone is as lucky as me. Second, very early in our journey, Bajaj Auto Limited joined us, which was itself a listed company, and they themselves we got to learn best practices. And they, of course, in our SHA and all, lot of guidelines were put. The second thing which I did the day I joined, I got my changed auditor, not for the reason, but main reason for changing was I wanted a Big Four because it just keeps us all up to the best practices in the industry, but also gives certain credibility to your financial reporting and internal control processes. We also had our ups and downs. There were times when we also had resource crunches, and I will say that time has not. It's still, we will further see it over our next 3-4 years of the journey. It's not that it's going to go away, kind of the pace we are going. But what was important that between 4 of us, as well as we have 2 board of directors representing 2 big companies, Bajaj Auto Limited as well as Magna, which is itself a listed company in New York Stock Exchange, a huge corporation. So at least there was a very strong governance structure which came from the top, and it went down. So we were lucky also, I would say. So lot of pitfalls which other startups face, we could somehow navigate and avoid them just because of the nature of the investors, as well as because of 100 plus years of experience between 4 of us.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you for sharing, that journey with us, and wish you a lot more success along the way as well. Moksha, coming back to you now, we touched upon this a little while earlier in the program, but, let's talk about it at length as far as what more really needs to be done to ensure that this robust startup ecosystem that we have created continues to grow to new heights, and we have better governance as a whole.
No, and that's an important question. I would say and I'll sort of go in an order of priority. The most important thing that needs to be done is that it has to be made. It should be easy for a founder to try something, experiment, and fail. What happens very often is that the way our systems are set up, even though there are improvements over time, it's challenging. So let's say, for example, if you have a GST registration and you want to surrender it, it's a pain. If you want to shut down a company, even though there are some simpler processes, it's still not as easy as it should be. So if the government could make it easy for people to fail, I think that would make a very big difference. More open regulators would help. So there has to be more room for experimentation and for taking on new ideas. So for example, let's say in the financial services area, there are sandboxes that have been created. More ideas like that where people can innovate and regulators can give them that space would be helpful. Thirdly, I would say that generally it would be helpful if we could move towards a more trust-based regulatory framework where compliance obligations are reduced. If you had to look at the number of reportings or compliances that an Indian company has to do, you'd be alarmed, is the word that I'll use. But that's the environment we live in. So of course, these are not insurmountable challenges, but there is room for improvement.
Absolutely. All right, gentlemen, it's time to get to closing comments now with the best way forward and what next and where do we go from here. Starting first with you, Anuj.
No, let's say I think it's high time we recognize corporate governance, and it is a value additive. It has to be started from the start when you start, and the one of the keystone or touchstone which I use, any event, exit, or if it is made public, how comfortable I am. If I am, then I think I am on the right track. If I'm not, I think this is a touchstone, or I would try to give to every other founder and CFOs of the startup ecosystem.
All right. And Mox, please close the show for us with your concluding remarks.
So my concluding remarks really would be that these are businesses that need to take big bets, and what's important is that risks are managed well, and for that corporate governance is important. And to that, I will add that in addition, what would help investors is if there is greater, if the environment is such that there is greater enforcement of contracts and contractual obligations, that I think would be for everyone's benefit.
All right, gentlemen, we'll have to leave it at that. Thank you so much for joining me on the program and sharing your views and putting things into perspective for us. Much appreciate your time here on Sansad TV.
Thanks.
All right, so what's coming out of this discussion is that startups need to be given more room for experimentation, and they should be allowed to fail. A cushion should be provided in case they fail so that they can get up again and be more adventurous in bringing about more businesses and more startups as well. Risks need to be managed with better corporate governance and a good board in place so that the risks are mitigated. And finally, of course, what we need is to ensure that these startups are given good workshops, good support along the way to try new things. With that, it's a wrap. This is Frank RAUSAN PEREIRA signing off.
संसद टीवी के और भी प्रोग्राम्स देखने के लिए सब्सक्राइब करें हमारा YouTube चैनल और हाँ, इन्हें लाइक और शेयर करना ना भूलें।